Welcome to ACF Capital Pulse. We're going to be sitting down with Christopher Nicholson, where he's going to delve into the transformative role of stem cell therapies in regenerative medicine, exploring their potential as a significant breakthrough in treating neurodegenerative diseases. Investors with an eye on long-term growth will discover the appeal of companies specializing in stem cell therapy, given their capacity to redefine healthcare paradigms. The narrative around stem cell use is evolving. The focus is shifting away from merely replacing tissue. Let's see what Christopher has to say.
Yeah, so it's an interesting area. It's like many biotech areas, it's had its ups and downs. It was launched as a potential cure-all for everything, and it's gone through a transition. They've really taken the stem cell therapy per se and said, okay, the original idea, which was we'll replace the cells in a patient's body by injecting the stem cells, and they then differentiate and they become the cell you need to replace whatever the condition is. So turns out, surprise, surprise, that happens to be a very complex, time-consuming, and rather expensive process. So investors then, they're usually as with biotech, it's cyclical. They get bitten and then they wait for the next innovation. So I think we're now on a new kind of trajectory where those stem cell type related therapies, rather than trying to replace the tissue that's damaged, whether it's a nerve cell or the liver or whatever it is, now what they're doing is they're using the natural properties of the stem cells and injecting them and getting them to stimulate the body's own repair system. So rather than replacing the cell, they're taking a different view and saying, okay, these cells are particularly good in the immune system, so we can send them in to deliver packages of curatives, if you like, which have a kind of local effect, and then stimulate the body to do the repair itself, which in the way is much more effective because, of course, biochemistry is an incredibly complex area, and you can say a general thing, but everybody is very slightly different. So it's only a general principle. So in a way, you're much better to get the body's own systems to work. And what this is an admission of is it's so complex, it's really difficult to understand. So rather than trying to understand it, let's stimulate it and let it do its own thing. And that is very different. So that's what we think has changed and made it exciting again.
Okay. It sort of stole one of my questions I was going to ask you, but
I'm sorry.
what is hot in stem cells right now then?
So it's a really interesting area. So there's about four in the US. Yeah, US. There's about 40 listed stem cell therapy companies doing all sorts of different things. One of the areas that is particularly interesting because it's so difficult to treat is the neurodegenerative disease area. So the things that people know about, Alzheimer's, ALS, which is also called Lou Gehrig's, after the famous baseball player who I think was the first kind of diagnosed patient. But it's a well-known disease, also called motor neuron disease in the UK and Europe. It's basically there are kind of four drugs available. None of them really treat the underlying causes because they're difficult to understand, with maybe the exception recently of torfasen, which was released in 2023, got its license in 2023. But I mean, in 20 years, there've been three attempts to cure, and most of them don't make a material difference to life expectancy, and they really just can treat treat a particular condition, and they're all drugs really in the typical sense of that word. So, they're chemicals put together, you take a tablet, take an injection, whatever it is, and they treat that way. So that's a really interesting area because there's a really big unmet need for something that actually might give people a longer lifespan or perhaps even, be a curative. So one of the areas there that we think is really interesting, I mean, it's highly speculative, it's a phase 3B, but we really like BCLI. Which is brainstorm therapeutics. There are another. I mean, if you don't like the look of brainstorm therapeutics, there are another, I think, 16 therapies, one way or another, that are trying to make their way through the pipe. But everyone's got to be clear. I mean, there's a very high failure rate. There's 25% of the studies have been stopped because of no clinical benefit since 2020, something like that anyway. But this is a phase 3B, so it's kind of close to the edge. Yes, it's highly speculative, massive unmet need. And it's a stem cell, whereas all the other therapies are basically a typical kind of drug therapy. Then another area which we really like is Vericel, which has got a 2 billion market cap, so a little bit safer. It's revenue generating, and it aims at the sports area. So it's sporting damage that it tries to treat with stem cell therapies. So that could be more attractive if you've got a less if your appetite for risk is a little bit lower.
Yeah, now stem cell therapy, it's a very expensive project. Obviously, which you touched on there before, the long-term benefits can be fantastic. But with clinical trial numbers, they're in the thousands over the last 20 years, and there's a pretty high failure rate to all that. So what are some of the most promising directions you're seeing?
Well, again, I would go for the specialist diseases that are very, very complex. They tend to have a relatively small number of patients. So you're talking tens of thousands, 30,000 US, 50,000 Europe, et cetera, et cetera. But they are very interesting. And we come again to these kind of neurodegenerative complaints like Alzheimer's and MS, et cetera. The issue is that these conditions often hit people in their 40s and 50s. Okay, this is a really important market. There are people who are some of the most productive in society at that cohort, that age range. They're getting to the peak of their skills. They're making a big difference. They also have good earning power. They're often well insured, and they often have political influence. And it's growing. So the proportion of people with these kind of degenerative diseases, the proportion of the population, it is growing for whatever reason, probably environmental, because a lot of them are, they do have genetic components, but they also have environmental components. And it's a powerful part of society that is well funded and often well insured. And so it's important. And these diseases are terrible. I mean, the way they treat people, the way they cause people to degenerate, is just horrific for the families. And it's not just the direct families, everybody around them, of course. So it's, you're affecting at least a cohort of 20 people every time somebody gets ill. So, and they're often untreated. They historically, people have used the typical drug system. And the issue there is that with these drug systems, you try to block a biochemical pathway. So it alleviates a symptom, but it's also this problem of hammer stroke P problem. So you're sloshing the body through with drugs, which often have a lot of pleasant side effects. They're affecting one little thing, but just to hit that little thing, you have to give far too much. I'm simplifying, but in over wine, you have to give far too much to have an effect. The difference with stem cell therapies is they go in and they basically, their aim is actually to be a curative, to get the body to regenerate, hence regenerative medicine, to get the body to regenerate and actually solve the problem itself. They've also proved to be very, well, it's difficult to say very safe, but they proved to have very few side effects, and they're looking like they're very safe. They're at least 30 years old as a concept. So we've got some longitudinal data from all the trials and things about side effects. They just look like a better approach.
Now, I've read that the stem cell therapy market's forecasted to be over 31 billion by 2030. What's driving this expansion? Like, is it realistic? Like, why shouldn't I just invest in a large cap or Magnificent Seven or some AI stocks?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And every time you sit down and look at a small cap, there's always part of you that says, why don't I just get on the tail of AI? Because it's or the latest trend. Well, the problem with investing in the latest trends is they can evaporate very quickly. As you and I both know, as long-standing participants in the markets, it looks great. I remember the telecoms boom. I'm sure you do. It looks great. And you wake up one morning and suddenly the whole thing's gone to hell, for want of a better word. Therefore, if you play across smaller caps, a lot of these can deliver that 10x number and sometimes an awful lot more. So it's being prepared to say, yeah, I put an amount in, sure, it can go to hell and I got nothing left. On the other hand, I might get 10 or 12x, maybe a lot more, and I do it over time and I can sit there and wait. I mean, you always have to diversify your portfolio. You can't just take one. That's too much of a bet. But I think if I'd answer the question, I think that's the thing. Look for the growth companies, and if you've got that portion of your portfolio that you can say to yourself, it's okay if that 5 or 10% goes, I'm still good. Then these are ways that can transform your capital appreciation.
Well, Christopher, thank you so much for your time today. People can go access the report at the ACF Equity Research website, which you can see in the link here and also in the description below. Thank you very much for your time, Christopher, and look forward to talking to you again next month.
Scott, thank you so much. It's always fun.
For everyone else out there, good luck investing.